1957, Sarah Graves sat down with a WPA interviewer to recount her experiences in slavery. When she talked about how she and her mother came to live in Missouri, an interesting exchange ensued. Sarah's legal owner had allotted her mother to another man who moved to Missouri in order to be closer to his daughter. Confused by the term, Sarah's interviewer asked her to explain exactly what allotment meant. Sarah explained the concept in the following way. You see, there were slave traders in those days, just like you got horse and mule and auto traders now. They bought and sold and hired slaves out. Yes, rented them out. Allotment means something like hired out, but the slave never got no wages. When a slave was allotted, somebody made a down payment and gave a mortgage for the rest, a chattel mortgage. Sarah concluded her explanation of allotment by saying that, quote, times don't change, just the merchandise, unquote. This small moment in Sarah's rich narrative about the experience of slavery in Missouri tells us at least two things. As an enslaved child, Sarah Graves came to learn what she knew about mortgages and the terms by which mortgages were secured and paid through her mother's experience of being allotted it during slavery. Sarah clearly saw connections between the commodification and sale of human beings before emancipation and the commodification of other things like horses, mules, and cars after freedom came. When we bear these things in mind, Sarah's testimony raises a series of questions. Did enslaved women's experiences of commodification, particularly encounters with the slave market, provide a specific kind of knowledge that they could use to secure personal and economic autonomy? If so, what kind of information did these experiences provide? How did enslaved women acquire it? And how did enslaved women use it? Drawing primarily upon formerly enslaved women's narratives and testimony, I argue that some enslaved women use their experiences of commodification and the discourses and ideologies of the slave market to acquire the discursive and intellectual tools with which to establish their personal and financial autonomy before emancipation. I examine the pervasiveness of the slave market, its ideologies and discourses in enslaved women's daily lives, and explore their direct and indirect encounters with three dimensions of the slave market economy: slave auctions and sales, the financial aftermath of slaveholder insolvency and deaths, and self-purchase, to reveal how enslaved women's encounters with the slave market provided opportunities to learn about credit, debt, and contracts, allowed them to engage in financial negotiations, and to develop strategies for fiscal management. I contend that as human property that was exchanged, bought, sold, hired, and divided amongst white Southerners, enslaved women were not simply objects of sale or potential liquidation. They took an active interest in the market processes to which they were subjected. They acquired extensive amounts of financial information as a consequence, and they used this knowledge to calculate their own value, establish prices for their freedom, decide terms of payment, and engage in financial negotiations with slave owners that eventually brought them their liberty. Beyond responding to these questions, I wanted to understand, recognize, and legitimate enslaved women as not simply authorities on the female experiences of enslavement, but as authorities on the economic dimensions of the system as well. I focus upon women who purchased their freedom or considered doing so, because far too often studies of freed women in the century before emancipation tend to dwell upon the women who used intimate and romantic relationships with white men to secure their liberty. While these freed women most certainly deserve to have their stories told, their experiences do not speak for all of the women who yearn for freedom and develop strategies to secure it. And we need to attend to the breadth of these women's experiences in order to understand this dimension of enslaved women's lives in bondage and in freedom. When enslaved women wanted to purchase their freedom, they had to do more than just accumulate the funds necessary to pay for themselves. They had to know just how much their freedom would cost, and they had to be familiar with the methods by which they could pay for it. And this knowledge was rooted in discourses and ideologies of the slave market. As they began to strategize about accumulating enough money to purchase their freedom or the liberty of loved ones, enslaved women mastered a certain understanding of their own commodification by imagining how much they would be worth to prospective slave buyers and sellers. And they used this knowledge to develop a financial plan to buy themselves and their families, a process that, if effective, would reduce, if not altogether, eliminate the prospect of sale upon the dreaded auction block or courthouse steps. References to the prices and values of slaves are omnipresent in formerly enslaved women's narratives and testimony, and we quickly learn that no enslaved person was out of the reach of the slave market, its discourses, or its ideologies. Time and again, we find enslaved women talking about how much they sold for or how much they were worth in the slave market. Sarah Benjamin told her WPA interviewer the following story. I was stripped stark modern naked and put on the auction block when I was a child and bid $350, but Master said no, because I was good and fat. We also find statements regarding the sale of loved ones. Catherine Clay said that Mama said she was sold once away from her mother, but they let her have her 4 children. She sold for $1,000. She said that was half price, but freedom was coming on. The slave market offered enslaved women more than a discourse with which to frame their financial strategies. It exposed them to the consequences of debt and the various means by which they could pay for themselves while avoiding it. Mary Armstrong described how her owner, Old Cleveland, take a lot of his slaves, what was in custom, and brings them to Texas to sell. You know, he wasn't supposed to do that, because when he's in custom, that's because he borrowed money on you, and you're not supposed to leave the place till he paid up. Enslaved women like Mary had a number of reasons to be concerned about and to learn how the Southern economy worked and how they as human property fit into their owner's financial schema. According to James Pennington, every change in the financial affairs and social and personal affairs of a slave owner and his or her children could have traumatic consequences for enslaved women's lives. Enslaved owners' insolvency emerges as a central feature of many of these enslaved women's stories about how they became the property of specific individuals. Enslaved women learned about these important dimensions of the slave market and the Southern economy in a variety of ways. Whether they belonged to slave traders and speculators, their families or neighbors like Sarah Ashley and Susan Merritt did, whether they were subjected to sale or they experienced the trauma associated with the sale of very close loved ones, or whether they encountered it when slave traders and speculators came to their owners' estates in order to buy or sell slaves like Fannie Moore did. The slave market, its arbiters, and its horrors shaped the lives of most enslaved women beyond the confines of commercial spaces in the 19th century South. Even enslaved women who did not find themselves in these circumstances acquired knowledge about the slave market. In the parlors of slave owners' homes, in the fields, in the slave quarters, on the roads leading to town, and on the streets of those towns, enslaved women could and did learn about the machinations of the slave market. They watched as their owners bought or swapped slaves with slave speculators who brought coffles and droves of enslaved people to their plantations. They formed parts of the crowds that gathered to watch slaves sold on the auction block. They were held captive in the establishments where fellow slaves were exposed for sale publicly and privately, and sometimes they went to talk to the slaves awaiting sale in local slave traders' yards. In addition to these modes of acquisition, enslaved women acquired knowledge of the slave market while listening to conversations between their owners and individuals who hoped to purchase them. They also learned about their value in the slave market through discussions with elders and kin. As slave owners talked amongst themselves, contemplated or declined prospective buyers' offers to buy their slaves in the very presence of those slaves, they repeatedly informed and reminded enslaved women of their value in the slave market. While most southern states prohibited enslaved women from entering into legally binding contracts, these women consistently struck financial deals with their owners and potential allies in hopes of purchasing themselves. Enslaved women understood the precarious nature of the agreements they made with and negotiations they entered into with white Southerners, and they learned important lessons about the ways race and gender shaped these interactions and their economic and contractual vulnerability. Enslaved women's capacity to reproduce increased their values in Southern slave markets, and living children complicated the process of self-purchase for many enslaved mothers. Enslaved women had to consider this when trying to establish the terms upon which they hoped to secure their freedom. In addition to this, when they decided to buy their freedom and were able to accumulate the funds to do so, they had to consider purchasing the liberty of their children before their own, leaving their children in bondage until they could afford to buy their freedom, or remaining in bondage until they all could be free. To be sure, enslaved men also contemplated the fate of the loved ones that they would leave behind in bondage, but these were overwhelming concerns for enslaved women who were typically responsible for the care and well-being of enslaved children. The slave market was one of the most pervasive features of the Southern economy, and when enslaved women decided to buy their freedom, they first had to recognize that they were commodities for sale and that ultimately they were buying themselves. While the slave market certainly brought more trauma and sorrow into their lives than anything else, it also offered these women one mode of acquiring knowledge about how the Southern economy worked and provided a language with which to frame their attempts to secure personal and financial freedom. As enslaved women negotiated with their owners about the terms upon which they could secure their freedom, and as they worked towards fulfilling these agreements, they learned important lessons about the risky and uncertain nature of their transactions, their status in the Southern economy, and about the marketplace more generally. In conclusion, these women were not individuals who lacked knowledge of the Southern economy or who lacked the skills to navigate Southern markets. Enslaved women possessed both, but they constantly faced resistance as they attempted to use their knowledge and skills in ways that would benefit them economically. These women learned about the Southern economy before emancipation came, and the slave market, its ideologies, and its discourses were part of their understanding. Thank you.
Good morning. In 2005, UC Berkeley's Bancroft Library exhibited a selection of Rosalie Ritt's courtroom drawings. Included in the collection were sketches made during the 1971 Soledad brothers trial. Imprisoned at Soledad Correctional Facility, African-American prison activists George Jackson, Fleta Drumgo, and John Cluchette became known as the Soledad brothers when they were charged with murder after a guard was killed. Their activism included teaching other imprisoned men to read and write and study towards the development of both mind and body against forms of oppression and dehumanization. This spirit of sharing was a radical movement towards relation in the midst of the isolation of incarceration and solitary confinement. Cut off from freedom and beauty, they formed relation. In a message to the Soledad Brothers Defense Committee, Fleta Drumgo wrote, "On behalf of all of us in Maximum, please don't reject or forget us, because this allows the monster to brutalize, murder, and treat us inhumanely. We are of you, we love you, and struggle with you." Fleta Drumgo and John Cluchette lived to see the trial. George Jackson is murdered by prison officials at San Quentin Prison days before the beginning of the trial. The images from the Soledad brothers' trials drawn by Ritz include a single sketch of George Jackson 12 days before his murder at San Quentin Prison. It is described as, quote, "the last time George Jackson was seen in public, preliminary hearing." Fleta Drumgo lives to see his release. He is shot to death on an Oakland street 3 years later. In my reading of the Soledad brothers' trial courtroom drawings, there is another line of the familial, not imagined as privacy and property or generational continuity, and there is an abundant loss. Up and against the still lifeless lines of the Soledad brothers' courtroom drawings, I pose a narration of familial and communal as itself a formation that is violently occluded by property and image, and in his attempt to understand the losses of history as the very history of race itself. June 25th, 1972, Fleta Drumgo writes from his prison cell, "I've been studying in the course trying to elevate my consciousness, thus survive under these dehumanizing circumstances, dash. Just the other day, June 21st, we was jumped on, dash. They cut our hair again." Fleta Drumgo imagines a course of freedom. It is a meditation on consciousness and survival and terror. His writing is bound by and between these modes of life. In this letter, it is also indicated in the syntax that dash, the broken line that moves between his writing and prison's common sense, getting jumped and cut. Fred Moten describes blackness as, quote, "the extended movement of a specific upheaval, an ongoing eruption that unarranges every line." Like Moten, Juanima Lubiano imagines the fight or the extended movement of a specific upheaval as central to the, quote, "chosen practice of blackness." It is an expression of relation, an extension of movement. Fighting for the body is a spatial practice. In this instance, Moten, Lubiano, and Drumgo provide a constellation, a poetics of permanent black revolt. One of the orbits of this work is Black Revolt, which is nothing less than a series of fights, getting jumped and jumping up, the fight for the writing, the fight for the body. In the drawings of the Soledad brothers' trial, there are a series of images that depict that eruption, the place where the body folds over and inward, that chosen practice, that fight. They are entitled Courtroom Melee. On August 26, 1971, 5 days after George Jackson's murder, Fleta Drumgo and John Cluchette enter the courtroom. They have been jumped, beaten, and burned, their heads shaved by prison officials. When community and family members in the courtroom witness Drumgo and Cluchette's entrance and mutilation, see the signs on their bodies, they go off. A mother goes off, that is, she screams. A man who is someone else's son rises to protect her from approaching riot police. The crisis escalates into a melee. Women who are also grandmothers and mothers move in and around their relations to protest the violence inflicted upon the imprisoned men. It is a radical movement towards relation, in the midst of the isolation of the courtroom, specially altered for the Soledad brothers' trial. After a pretrial hearing just days after George Jackson's murder, Rosalie Ritz lingers in the courtroom where she draws. The courtroom is layered in glass and steel, reflections abound, and vision and sound are muffled in the thickness of the walls. In her unpublished manuscript, Trial, Art, Media, and the Law, Rosalie Ritz writes, "This was my first chance to examine the specially altered court prepared for the Soledad brothers' trial. I was in no hurry to leave. The bulletproof wall, made of sheets of heavy glass held up by 3-inch metal strips every few feet, reflected viewers' faces, including my own strained white face. It was hard to follow dialogue. Participants in the trial well were required to use microphones, so those of us in the spectator section would be able to hear. Attorneys and judges as well turned their heads often, and the sound was then lost. The mother was witnessing through glass, seeing herself scream, all sound movements subject to the curvature and thickness of the bulletproof glass." As sketches of black radical figures, mother, brother, son, as forms of seizure, aesthetic and social, racial, sexual, economic containment, how do the still lines of courtroom drawings trace a wondrous poetics of movement against the stiff and cagey operations of racial and sexual domination? As deformed, incorporated, and inauthentic forms, the courtroom drawings set the stage for that which is hard to follow, partial views, muffled sound. In the twists and turns of Ritz's drawings, black radical movement as practiced in crisis, formation and rupture, deformation and relationality, a mother's scream against the mute walls and the visible tortured body of her son, another son's jump up, runs over the page, opens troubles, and moves the line to the melee you don't see, the attack on Drumgo and Cluchette following Jackson's murder. The after effects are recorded in Ritz's drawings. The fight extends, is taken up by the mothers, the brothers, a community of witnesses. Here's an excerpt of Rosalie Ritz's description of the courtroom melee. "The back door opened and the defendants were escorted into the room. A woman viewer let loose a hair-raising wail and my head swiveled. She leaned forward, placed her arms on the back of the seat in front of her, and then dropped her head in anguish on those arms and raised her voice to a shriek. The defendants, their hair chopped off irregularly, advanced toward the defense counsel table looking tired, downtrodden, bewildered, confused, their hands manacled and their legs in irons. Their mothers, one of whom had raised the loud cry. A bailiff was moving toward the wailing mother in a purposeful manner, and a young man rose to intervene. The level of noise rose as the defendants, acting as one, tore off their shirts. Somehow I was on my feet, my back pressed against the cold, cold glass wall. In my ear was a voice ordering, 'Rosalie, draw.' My sketch pad was out. I was struggling against the urge to duck down and cover my eyes to block out the sight of people being brutally beaten. My eardrums cracked painfully, assaulted by the terrific sounds of people screaming in terror and pain. They were weaving, ducking, holding arms around their heads, trying to get to the only exit, and it was blocked by their tormentors, the police. Clubs struck heads and shoulders and made a thudding sound. There was the rat-a-tat as they missed and hit the wall or seat. Each time the glass was struck, there was a shudder, which I felt on my back and all through my body. Brilliant flecks of color, blood, flew through the air to land willy-nilly on officers' helmets, face masks, sleeves, on paneled walls, on the glass where it slowly stripped down. I turned to flip pages of my sketch pad to study with wonder drawings made inside that court during the nightmare, which I was unable to remember myself sketching. So the broken line in fluted drum goes, quote, "Just the other day, June 21st, we was jumped on, dash, they cut our hair again," points in many directions, back a year toward this moment in the courtroom, which via its caption and Ritz's inscription writing is imagined as crisis and the collapse of order, and towards the everyday violence, the horrible same, the, quote, "just the other day," that is constituent of and upholds imprisonment. Inez Williams, Fleta Drumgo's mother, wrote in an article, "Fleta, John, and George were arraigned in Salinas, Monterey County on Monday, February 14th, 1970. There were only 5 black people in the courtroom. We stood outside as the van drove up from Soledad. They were chained together. They fell out of the van. I started screaming. Why are they treating them like that? But these people are mad. They are vicious. What happened to innocent until proven guilty? They acted like they wanted to hang them right then. Newsmen were running over each other, taking pictures. I turned around and people were running and laughing as if they were going to a circus. It was May Day. Oh my God. The story that Fluta Drumgo's mother tells is another document of the practice and crisis of Black radical movement at and in the line, and sets the condition of her son's emergence in these documents that, as Saidiya Hartman writes, quote, return the dead to us in the very form in which they were driven out of the world. Fluta's mother, Inez, told me a story which speaks to the foundational exclusions, the non-alignment between surface, what the drawings actually depict, and their figuration, the shadow or illegible imprints of that depiction, and all that both is and cannot be indicated in that non-alignment. She was in a used bookstore and saw a copy of Soledad Brother that had a picture of Fluta in it. He was her only child. The book was $70 and she couldn't afford to buy it. In the archive, I remember this as I read his letters and all his talk about moms and requests for books and literature. Fluta, her son, book-loving, the reader. I'm struck by their likeness and longing, that incommensurable touch. In Haunted Life, Visual Culture, and Black Modernity, David Marriott asks, but how then do we read this cold, implacable indifference to death, Black death, and how can we continue to look when lying on the cold floors, we're unable to retrieve the beloved from the shadows, end quote. The violated relation, the irretrievable beloved. September 21st, 1971. Taisha, what it is, sister love, right on, badness at its highest stage. I could express my feelings about it fiendishly, but like, you know that my letter wouldn't reach its destination, and like I'm tried of rhetoric. Check this out. To change the air of this letter, let me say that you also on my mind daily. As far as the visiting thing you mentioned, that's dead. Like we can only visit our families, supposedly, and attorneys, and that for only half an hour. And like I couldn't even see moms the other day because of the lack of space, supposedly, but you know how that are. You can see my mother at 282 Clipper, San Francisco. She's staying there because of the madness. Mom's is right on, and like she would really enjoy hearing from you, but let me warn you, she's lazy on the writing side. You said that our relationship, you didn't know if it was good or bad. Taisha, revolutionaries supposedly be ready for death. When they get me, you just keep struggling to the utmost. My death will only intensify your commitment and the commitment of others, I hope. As you should know, life is a constant endurance, so like don't let that hang you up. I will exist through you and others just as other revolutionaries exist through us. Like I could go on, but I just want to say don't let the thought of my death or anyone's death immobilize you. P.S. I read the books you mentioned. Like they aren't allowing us any literature at this time. I want you to read The Black Woman by Tony Cade if you haven't read it. It deals with the things going on in, he puts a smiley face and then the letter's torn. Juanima Lubiana writes that, quote, remembering is enlarging a space where before there prevailed simply an account of ghetto violence. During the course of my research, I sat with my partner and his cousins, and we remembered by talking about our earliest memories. Later, and when we are alone, he tells me that his first memories are of Fluta in the bushes next to his house. In his memory, Fluta was found in the bushes. Not those bushes, but bushes like those, and he loved Fluta, and so in his mind, Fluta was in those bushes. His childhood wonder, Fluta's death, moves in memory through the rest of life. Fluta Drumgo's letters, Rosalie Ritz's manuscript and drawings, they are unfinished, contested forms, moving at the surfaces, engendered by racial terror. They are some part of and still life. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Not yet. During the late 1960s, are you hearing it yet?
No, try another mic. Just pass down one this way.
During the late 1960s, male prisoners at San Quentin circulated handwritten pages of the Communist Manifesto by way of a clothesline strung from cell to cell. Today, by contrast, women prisoners frequently circulate three devalued genres: narratives of victimization, African-American urban fiction with titles such as Forever a Hustler's Wife and Thugs and the Women Who Love Them, and evangelical Christian self-help books. Although this contrast creates anxiety among many scholars and activists, I've learned that it indicates far more about the climate for prisoners' reading in the two time periods than about the readers themselves. Since the prisoners' rights movement of the 1960s and 70s gave way to the retributive justice framework of the 1980s, prisoners' opportunities for reading and education have sharply declined. Prisons radically reduced their library budgets, which decimated their book collections, converted library space into prison cells, and installed televisions as deliberate pacification tools. In the prisons where I have conducted research, the libraries are now funded entirely by revenue from the vending machines, and that funding is shared among several programs in the prison. Furthermore, due to security concerns, prisoners can only receive brand new books sent directly from publishers. No used books are allowed, which means that buying books is far too expensive for most women. Even women's access to prison libraries is limited, since some penal officials fear that libraries serve as a gay bar. So women must sign up 1 week in advance to visit the library, and their visits are limited to 30 minutes. Many books are also banned, from Harry Potter, which depicts witchcraft, to medical texts that include images of women's breasts. Racialized restrictions on reading, which have been in place since the birth of the penitentiary, likewise delimit prisoners' access to books, as one example among many, while allowing Ku Klux Klan publications such as Negro Watch and Jew Watch. The Texas penal system has banned Toni Morrison's novel Paradise on the grounds that it contains, quote, information of a racial nature that seems designed to achieve a breakdown of prisons through inmate strikes or riots. While penal officials fear that Morrison's references to the KKK and the civil rights and Black Power movements will lead to a breakdown of prisons, they argue that Klan publications do not threaten their ability, quote, to maintain order and security. Prisoners' opportunities for reading have been further curtailed by recent legal precedents. In its 2006 decision, Beard v. Banks, the U.S. Supreme Court deemed it constitutional for a Pennsylvania prison to deny secular newspapers and magazines to prisoners in its long-term segregation unit, on the grounds that this denial of reading material serves as, quote, an incentive for inmate growth. Because these prisoners have no access to television, radio, telephone, or visitors, they receive no current news. The two dissenting justices insist that access to the full range of ideas is crucial for preserving one's sense of humanity and citizenship, but the majority opinion deems such claims moot when, quote, dealing with especially difficult prisoners. The fact that African Americans and Latinos are overrepresented in maximum security prisons makes this denial of citizenship even more troubling. Exacerbating these trends, Congress eliminated Pell Grants for prisoners in 1994, which sparked dramatic cuts in all levels of educational programming and contributed to an increase in the presence of evangelical Christian educational programs and reading materials in prisons. At a time when the U.S. Supreme Court has authorized the denial of reading materials as an incentive for inmate growth, it seems more important than ever to recognize prisoners' vital and varied efforts to think, understand, grow, and remain connected to the world beyond the prison. I was privileged to witness such efforts while conducting research for my recently published book. Over the course of several years, I conducted extensive individual interviews and group discussions with 94 women imprisoned in North Carolina, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. This research taught me that, like the male prisoners who were reading Marx in the 1960s, many women prisoners look to reading as a means of empowerment and as a tool for understanding the racial and economic inequalities that pave the road to prison. Extending the tradition of prisoners' self-education, women use popular female-gendered genres to situate their experiences within broader contexts, experiment with new ways of being, and maintain a sense of dignity, hope, and human community. Because my book includes only a fraction of the reflections that women shared with me, I decided to create a companion volume of interviews called The Story Within Us, Readings and Reflections from Women Prisoners, which features a life narrative interview and a reading interview from 11 women prisoners. Publishing this collection feels very important to me because it includes far more of the women's voices without my analysis and will be more accessible than my academic book. I consider prisoners themselves a primary audience for this book, and the 11 interviewees are very excited about appearing in it. However, I've been having a very difficult time getting it accepted by a publisher, which is part of why I wanted to present it today. The story within us draws particular attention to the experiences of African American women. Although scholars and activists have produced groundbreaking work about women of color's experiences in the criminal justice system, explicit discussions of Black women remain relatively scarce in scholarship about crime. Michelle Alexander's important bestseller, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, serves as a case in point. While illuminating the historical and ongoing ways in which U.S. penal system creates a racialized caste system, Alexander refers to women only as supporters of criminalized men, as those who, quote, love their sons, husbands, and partners and understand their plight as current and future members of a racial undercast. This erasure of African American women's own experiences in the criminal justice system is especially problematic given the dramatic increase in rates of incarceration for women in general. The number of women prisoners is now 7 times larger than it was 30 years ago. And for African American women in particular, who represent 28% of all incarcerated women and are 3 times more likely to be incarcerated than white women. The narratives featured in my edited collection illuminate how mass incarceration is a matter of racial justice for women, too. Moreover, the featured narratives help to tell a largely untold story about the crucial intellectual work that some women perform with the paltry materials available to them in prisons. In an effort to outline a few dimensions of this broader story, I'd like to focus my remaining comments on one of the women featured in the interview collection. Sissy is a 46-year-old African-American woman who's been incarcerated since age 19 and will likely spend the rest of her life in prison. Although she may not fit the presumed profile of an intellectual, Sissy engages in valiant efforts to maintain a life of the mind in a setting that radically circumscribes this possibility. Her vibrant intellectual life is a testament to her incredible resourcefulness, creativity, and determination to make a way out of no way. Explaining her love of reading, Sissy says, I've grown up basically in prison, and it has impacted my life a lot because there's things that I don't know about society because I haven't lived out there in 27 years. Reading thus serves as a crucial means for Sissy to maintain a sense of connection with the world beyond the prison gates. I keep up on a lot of the politics, radios, papers, all that's in the news, she explains, because even though I'm in prison, the different things that's happening out there still affects me. Sissy also describes reading as an important means of engaging with difference and learning to understand and empathize with others. It teaches me about people, their culture, their way of thinking, their way of doing things, she says, and that keeps you from being prejudiced. This sentiment has inspired Sissy to read as much as possible about a wide range of religions, from Islam to Mormonism to Judaism. As she explains, I just learned about all of them because they're a part of who society is. And when you educate yourself and your family to other people's way of life, then your children will not grow up being ignorant to somebody that they don't know anything about. Foregrounding the role that reading plays in her embrace of difference, Sissy continues, whether you're in jail or whether you're out in the world society, we still have a responsibility to treat each other as human beings. And to learn and understand, you have to put yourself out there. And some people are afraid. And because they're afraid, they need to read. To me, if you can't relate to it, then read about it. And if you still can't relate to it, at least you can't say, I never tried to understand. If you don't try to understand, then that's a loss to you. I think that's why we have the problems we have now. You know, some people don't want to go there. As part of her continuing effort to put herself out there, Sissy's been learning as much as possible about topics such as law, women's history, and African American history. Describing her extensive research about Black history, she said, it was amazing. I was reading a book about Black authors, a book about where did the roots of African American music come from. I read about the 60s, okay? How did African Americans come into television? How did they come into radio? I read about singers, opera singers, about how the president used different Black leaders. I read about Frederick Douglass. I read about poets. My mind was just boggled down with all this stuff. And I read about civil rights and everything. And I'm like, wow, I learned a lot about the roots of Black history. Sissy's narrative also underscores how books can provide aesthetic pleasure and an environment in which sensory delight is sorely lacking. I like to read art books, she explains. They show you pictures of way back, 15th, 16th century pictures, and I like to look at them and compare them to like Picasso and Monet. I like to trace the centuries and come up into the decade of time today and look how art has changed and how they judge art today. Sissy also recounted how she became an artist in prison. I started drawing for my daughter to let her have a part of me because I couldn't be there, so she had something of me that she could be proud of. Furthermore, Sissy taught herself to crochet by reading craft books, and she wants to offer a class to help other women make things for their children and support themselves upon their release. Another central dimension of Sissy's reading practice is her ongoing effort to think through the possibilities and limitations of silence. Sissy learned about the protective role that silence can play from her childhood experiences with school desegregation in Mississippi. Sometimes we'd come home with gum all in our hair, and my grandmother had to cut our hair to get stuff out, she recalls. We would come back looking worse than when we went because of what we had to go through just to be there. And that was when my grandmother said, suck your gut in, hold your head up high, you get back on that bus, and whatever they say to you, do not say anything. I don't want you to come home dead. Reflecting on this experience, Sissy continued, I learned that certain things you have to be quiet about and let it pass because it could be worse for you if you talk back. There's some things that's best left unsaid. At the same time, however, Sissy's long-term sexual abuse by a family member, followed by severe abuse and violence at the hands of other men, taught her about the dangers of maintaining silence. Her family insisted that she remain silent during her trial and repeatedly counseled her not to share any of her experiences with prison social workers. Sissy now realizes, my mouth was shut, but that hurt me more than it helped me. I didn't have the understanding that there's just a time when you need to open up your mouth and stand up for yourself. She was gradually able, in her words, to go back and face my past with the help of another prisoner who took her under her wings as her bigger sister. Reading other women's stories has also played a key role in Sissy's ongoing efforts to reckon with her experiences. Although she spoke very emotionally during her life narrative interview, in reviewing her interview transcript, she redacted many references to pain, including details about her extensive experiences of abuse. She seemed to find it overwhelming to encounter her history on paper, yet she loves reading books about women whose lives mirror her own. Engaging with others' stories seems to provide the necessary distance for Sissy to encounter herself. Some of her favorite books include T.D. Jake's novel, Woman Thou Art Loosed, Iyanla Vanzant's Yesterday I Cried, celebrating the lessons of living and loving, and televangelist Joyce Meyer's Beauty for Ashes, Receiving Emotional Healing. According to Sissy, such books have helped her to understand that her history of abuse, quote, shaped a lot of the choices that I made, and I think it had a lot to do with why I'm in prison. She particularly appreciates Van Zant's acknowledgement of how frightening it can be to ask for help when you're accustomed to having needs denied. Noting that asking for help is still her greatest fear, Sissy explained, one of the proverbs was, a folded arm never receives. Sometimes I fold my arms, and I don't mean to, but I had them open so many times and never received the things that should have helped me, and I always got them like cut off at the elbow, so I closed my arms. Like many women prisoners, Sissy also uses unlikely reading materials to make meaning from her experiences, such as V.C. Andrews' lurid tales about incest and family drama, the best known of which is the Flowers in the Attic series. She offered a particularly moving account of how Sidney Sheldon's novels have taught her about physical tenderness and intimacy, explaining that she only knew how to, quote, shut my mouth and let a man do whatever he wanted to do during sex. Sissy said, I never had a man rub my body or give me massages or anything like that, or just rub my arm, none of those nice things that you do. I've never had anybody do anything like that to me. And to read about those things, I felt sad, you know? But then I was like, that's all right, because now I know. Now I know that you can be intimate with a person without having the penetration. You can have a man kiss your cheek or just run their hand through your hair and not have to feel that you have to give them something in return for it. Sheldon's books also taught me how to take care of myself if I want to look nice, Sissy explained. I know how to do it for me. I learned to love me and not worry about what someone thinks about how I smell or how I speak. Drawing on books as surrogate parents, teachers, and gentle lovers, Sissy has learned to claim her space in the world as one who deserves to be treated and to treat herself with the tenderness reserved for the beloved. As part of her ongoing attempt to counter damaging silences, Sissy plans to write a book and share the wisdom that she has gained. As she puts it, I know my past and I know me today. I know which way I'm going and I know how to get there. However, given the perils of journal writing in prison and the fact that prisoners must fit everything they own into 2.4 square feet, Sissy faces particular challenges in documenting her experiences. Her method is to write very spare notes about experiences that seem especially significant to her. You have to pick and choose what you write, she explains. I don't take up a whole page of writing a whole bunch of stuff. As she envisions it, Sissy's book will be about, quote, coming to terms with life, learning to know who you are, to know what's a healthy choice and an unhealthy choice. Because I was told to shut up, none of the things that should have been said were said. There's a time to be silent, and there's a time not to. Sissy also wants her book to help readers, quote, understand life goes on regardless of where you're at, even if you're locked up. Indeed, prisoner stories do not end with incarceration, despite their erasure in popular and scholarly accounts, and despite the dehumanizing policies that restrict their intellectual lives. Imprisoned women find myriad ways to claim their humanity and practice freedom in the midst of a death-generating institution. In Sissy's words, and I'll give her the last word, we have to live our life today to the best of our ability, and I want each day to be where I did something good to somebody. I don't want anybody to remember my name. I just want to be one of the ones to make a difference today, because as human beings, we're affected by everything each other does. Thank you.
Can you hear me? I'd like to start by thanking Mia Bay, Barbara Savage, Fair Griffin, and Martha Jones for creating such a remarkable collective space and framework for Black women's scholarship. Participating in it has been truly a wonderful experience. This morning's panel is centered on confronting the carceral state, and the papers include a wide spectrum of time and methodology, ranging from the pecuniary knowledge of the slave market and chattel principle to reading literacy and testimony of incarcerated women in today's prisons. I will first make some more general remarks about what these papers evoked from me in their totality before exploring in greater depth some of the particular themes and ideas raised in each article. First, in thinking about the content of how these works interlink with the theme of confronting the carceral state, I was reminded of something that I think about often, which is a depth and range of African American and African diaspora intellectual production across time and space, and how this rich history is shared more broadly by all oppressed people. The importance of consciousness and self-knowledge in the face of external control has been a matter of survival. Whether through the concept of the prison intellectual or Edward Said's exile intellectual, this type of knowledge production has played a foundational role in national liberation movements, struggles for decolonization, or against internal colonization. The painful knowledge born of confinement has been crucial to Black mobilization and resistance across time. This is both literal and metaphoric. The published histories of Harriet Jacobs, Malcolm X, Assata Shakur, Angela Davis, George Jackson, Huey Newton, and many, many others played an essential role in social movements from abolition through the Black Power movement of the post-war era. And they're important for mobilizing people, but also this is how these movements, through the production of books and pamphlets, also raised money. So it served dual functions. So my first point is to think about how the experiences of slavery and modern prisons are interrelated, not only as sites of repression, control, and dehumanization, but also as important spaces of creativity and liberation, precisely because of the limitations placed on the body. In other words, the body can be held, but not the soul, spirit, or imagination. And an image that comes to mind is from a recent film by the Black installation artist Steve McQueen's Hunger, which is about the prison hunger strike of the IRA and the leader Bobby Sands. In the conclusion of the film, as Sands is dying in captivity, his childhood recollections are intercut with the scenes of a bird ascending in flight, as if to say you can take the body but not the spirit. From the work of Betty Saar in the Black Arts Movement to Toni Morrison's Nobel Prize speech, the bird as an image of liberation in the face of confinement is a deep and resonant one that links for me the freedom of the mind in contrast to the external and material control of the physical self. We might call this carceral knowledge. I'd now like to talk about the three papers and how they interrelate with this theme and how they're in dialogue with one another. In some cases, my comments are based on earlier versions of the papers and also longer papers. In many cases, some of the things that I talked about had been addressed in the conference paper. The first paper, Stephanie Jones Rogers, To Buy What I Had Already Had a Right to Possess. This paper explores how enslaved people confronted and even utilized the chattel principle in order to obtain their freedom through self-purchase. Indeed, in Jones Rogers' paper, the very concept of the chattel principle itself is a carceral knowledge born of a blacksmith who purchased both his and his family's freedom. This required mastering a bifurcated set of knowledges of self as both subject and object. In Jones Rogers' words, quote, slavery was possible not only because of slave owners' ability to commodify human beings and to assign values to them as things that could be bought and sold. Slave owners' ability to hold human beings as property and to dispose of them as such were also key to the perpetuation of slavery and the economy that thrived because of it. Her paper and the larger dissertation from which it is drawn shows how slaves resisted this market principle, not only in the act of sale, but by preventing it through self-purchase, both for self and for family, which is especially meaningful in the case of women. Mastery of pecuniary knowledge was essential to this process, not only to accumulate the funds, but to, quote, know just how much their freedom would cost, and to be familiar with the methods by which they could pay for it. Enslaved people used this knowledge to develop a financial plan. Jones Rogers provides examples of both successes and failures, with the complete absence of legal protection to make contracts binding as the most common cause for the latter. I had some follow-up questions about this I thought we might discuss in greater depth in the question and answer period. First, could you talk about the relationship of literacy to this process, even more than you already did in the conference version? It seems to be the direct background, but is not addressed directly in this paper. How much of this knowledge was obtained through orality, rumor, and gossip, and how much through writing? Also, I was curious about the psychic costs of mastering the market and the difficulties that people experienced in negotiating for themselves and their family members as bills of sale. And the testimonials and captivity narratives, do they address the lived contradictions of this experience? Rosalie Romero, Black Radical Movements and Courtroom Drawings. This paper moves us forward to the height of the Black Power movement into the trial of the Soledad brothers in 1971. The courtroom drawings are particularly haunting because of their portraiture of George Jackson 12 days before his death. Romero reads this image of Jackson as a, quote, abundant loss. Through the words and drawings of the Soledad brothers, drawing on a range of theorists, Romero seeks to make a larger statement about what they reveal about the larger meaning and epistemology of blackness and black resistance. In her words, quote, Fred Moten describes blackness as the extended movement of a specific upheaval and ongoing eruption that anarranges every line. Like Moten, Juanima Lubiano images the fight or extended movement of a specific upheaval as central to the practice of blackness. Fighting for the body is a spatial practice, a poetics of permanent black revolt, end quote. There's several points I thought we might discuss. The first is the relationship between word and image. The Soledad brothers and George Jackson's epistolary collection is how many of us have learned about the Soledad brothers. It was also used as a activist work in the period. How did the use of these courtroom drawings from a spectator at the trial make us view this body of knowledge differently? So the question is, how is image and text engaged? Do the courtroom drawings make you interpret the actual intellectual production of the Soledad brothers differently? Secondly, I was curious about some other sources that you might put into dialogue with with these drawings, and especially those of Rochelle McGee. In the Bay Area and the prison activist community, it's often Rochelle McGee's drawings that are used, the production that's done in prison. And they have actually an interesting dialogue between the two papers, because many of these drawings are of popular cultural figures, you know, of Michael Jackson, of Prince, of a lot of, so they're drawings from the 70s and 80s, a lot of them engaging with popular culture, with the world beyond prison. So the idea of this vernacular production is true both in literature and in drawings, as well as him doing more traditional portraiture of people he knew. So I'm curious about that, about what would it mean to put self-representation into dialogue with these courtroom drawings. Finally, I was also curious about ways to talk about race, because I think particularly in the context of the trial and the Soledad brothers' trial, in many ways, trials by their nature are the staging of state violence and state control, where the actors, the people being prosecuted, have limited agency. So I was wondering if there are other ways also to look at the drawings, both through what they reveal to us about whiteness and state violence. This seems especially important given the Panthers' focus really on always inverting the lens of power. So really trying to use image and to use words to powerfully represent state violence. And that's true of their use of the pig, of Emily Douglas's drawings, their use of caricature, the bootlickers gallery. I mean, in some ways, they're trying to invert hypervisibility and to focus on forms of state violence and white violence. Okay, Megan Sweeney, The Story Within Us, Reading and Reflections on Women Prisoners. Sweeney transports us to a different moment in the history of prisons, one of mass incarceration, privatization, and the outright and explicit warehousing of people. And I thought that she framed it beautifully in her opening remarks, talking about this as the period that follows the 60s and 70s, one of extreme state retrenchment, of cutbacks, of the privatization of prisons, and largely the stripping of prison educational programs, which were so important to the kind of prison movement we saw in the 60s and 70s. Compellingly, Sweeney focuses on life narratives of incarcerated women and centers on their experience of reading. Here, both reading and oral response to popular and vernacular writings is foregrounded rather than writing itself. Although, as we see at the tail end of Sissy's narrative, the process of reading leads her in turn to wanting to write her own narrative, her own book. So in some sense, these can't be entirely separated. In the words of one woman, quote, "With no job, no money, no possessions, no phone privileges, I was verging on a non-person. Thank God for books," end quote. In its focus both on women and this aspect of literacy, of reading, Sweeney's work does a wonderful job of expanding the history both of the carceral state and carceral knowledge to look at the gendered particularity of confinement, the history of women in mass incarceration, and an era of state retrenchment and neoliberalism. This is especially important given the current political struggle to maintain prison libraries, educational facilities, and college programs in the face of retrenchment and ideological backlash. She raises a number of compelling issues that warrant further discussion. First, might this example of reading in prison be understood as part of a larger transhistorical narrative of Black literacy culture, ranging from slavery to the contemporary period? And I think Maisha Fisher's work on Black literacy culture is very important here. She, in her first book, did participant observation in Black bookstores and spoken word events, and she used it as a way to talk about the popular culture around literacy. So this reading culture in prisons, to me, seems part of an extension of a larger phenomena, which is a very rich one. Secondly, I was really struck within the testimony of Sissy herself, how she talked about her pleasure in reading and the sustenance of reading as contrasted with her experience of school integration. The real pain, maybe you could talk about this some more, about what she chose to redact. because it sounded as if her personal trauma was redacted, but she kept in the sections on school integration. But the pain with which it's written of physical assaults in school and the mother's attempt to protect her and the resonance of the memory for her, she almost uses talking about that as a way, I think, to talk about other trauma. And so I was just struck by that, of this notion of a very personal and intimate idea of education that's solitary. In some ways, the process of isolation is, it contrasts her own trauma in learning in educational institutions. So we might think about that. I think this also is interesting, thinking about the question of reading and literacy, not only in the context of organized movements. As a Panther scholar, I immediately think about study groups and Black studies and all the different ideological institutes of the Panther Party. But your paper made me think about the importance of the individual, in a sense, of this individual relationship to the text and how important it is, really, for people's survival in the context of prolonged confinement. So finally, to conclude, and coming full circle and talking about this relationship between slavery and incarceration and the importance of the carceral state, in order to fully excavate this history, we can draw insights from other time periods and other subject fields, talking about mass incarceration. In her groundbreaking essay, Soul, Murder, and Slavery, historian Nell Irwin Painter has argued for the development of interdisciplinary methods to compile a, quote, fully loaded cost accounting of the far-reaching effects of slavery's regime of violence. Similar wide-ranging inquiry is needed into the cumulative impact of criminalization and incarceration of African Americans, not only in the Jim Crow South, but also throughout the Southern diaspora of the post-war North and West. In total, these papers have provided us with a broad and compelling look at the interrelation between knowledge and confinement, and are moving us towards what this might look like.
Is the fact that literacy wasn't absolutely vital to the acquisition of this knowledge. They were able to, as I mentioned in my paper, just overhear conversations between slave buyers and slave owners about the price that they were going to command or demand in the negotiations that went on between those individuals. And you have women talking about this experience as children, talking about overhearing conversations about their family members and their kin, or fellow enslaved women. So literacy wasn't absolutely vital to the acquisition of this knowledge, but rumor and gossip were certainly part of that knowledge acquisition process. So you often have conversations about how much someone else sold for, who was potentially going to be sold. The slave trader was on his way, and they heard about it through the grapevine. So you do see that rumor and gossip are a fundamental part of knowledge acquisition. And the psychic cost of mastering the market is something that you constantly see mentioned in these formerly enslaved women's testimony and narratives, because by prefacing or ending their conversations about the slave market, they talk about the horror, the trauma, the possibility that someone could be sold just like a hog or a cow or a horse. They're consistently remarking upon the incredulous possibility that someone, a human being, could be commodified and sold in this way, and the impact that it had upon the community as well as the family members, the close loved ones who had to see their family members and loved ones sold away. And you also see resistance. James Pennington was flabbergasted by the idea that he would even, like his owner would actually pose a potential sale to him. He was flabbergasted, so was Harriet Jacobs. She was overwhelmed by the idea that, she had patrons who, offered to sell, to buy her. But the very idea that they would buy her, to have someone else own her, even if they were buying her freedom for her, was appalling. So you see a resistance to this idea of human commodification, but it was a necessary evil, one in which some were willing to accept in order to have their freedom.
Thanks for your comments. I appreciate them. I think oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Thanks. I think for me in this project, I'm trying to think precisely through the relationship between word and image, sort of what it would mean to encounter these images, because they started, well, they were shown in the exhibition at first, and I encountered the exhibition and began to wonder what it would mean to encounter them through recognition, to apprehend them through recognition. And so in the writing of the project, I tried to bring the word, the letters, in as a way to sort of create a circulation between image and word in a way that would sort of invoke the caption, you know, because Ritz always wrote a caption with the images, but sort of thought, what would it mean to sort of provide another frame with Drumgo's letters or Inez Williams' poetry, really. So, thank you.
So thank you for your comments also. I wanted to say a little bit about the explicit connections between slavery and incarceration in the context of reading. And at the time of emancipation, when the convict lease system was put into place, it ended up substituting for slavery in a pretty direct way. And there was a lot of emphasis before that on reading in penal contexts as transformative, but the prisoners who were being invoked at that time were largely white men. So when Black people started filling prisons, the emphasis on reading dropped, and there were almost no opportunities for reading or education. So there's a way in which the prohibition of reading in slavery was directly continued in the carceral system. And in my mind, so much of the restrictions on literacy today still suggest that in some ways literacy is a form of white male property. So the other thing that I wanted to say is I love very much that suggestion to think through Sissy's self-education as opposed to the traumatic education that she had as a child. But something that I've thought about a lot in the course of doing this work is the social and intersubjective dimensions of reading practices that are usually parsed as individualistic. So something like a self-help reading practice is actually very much involved with engaging others through a book, that a book is sometimes a surrogate for a mentor or a parent or a friend, but it can also be a conduit to other people. So even Sissy with Sidney Sheldon, she talked with her friend quite a bit about trying to understand what was happening in those novels around sexuality. So the books become, even when it's an individual reading practice that's not about a study group or something like that, that books become a kind of connective tissue for conversations with other people, for a relationship, and even a sense of relationship with characters. For some women who are so profoundly isolated, there's a real sense of having a companion and a mentor in the character of a book, or even an author.
Thank you all very much, and I now throw it open to questions. I'm sure that we all have many questions. Yes.
So I have two questions. My name is Alexis. Again, I have two questions before. But,
Got a microphone here.
so my first question is for Megan Sweeney about if you could talk more about your work and its relationship to prison activism. I think that would be really interesting. So the things that I know that there has been a review of your book by a woman prisoner in Makeshift Magazine, which is my favorite anti-racist feminist magazine. But and I can see how people who are advocates for prisoners and who are working for prison reform would really be able to use your work as a powerful tool. And I can also imagine how people who are prison abolitionists might have questions about whether your work rehabilitates prisons as a site of rehabilitation. So if you could talk also about the relationship, or how you see your work possibly moving beyond depicting how people survive prison into how it could empower people to end prisons. And then my second comment and question is for Mercy, and I'm really grateful for the way that you performed and reflected and maybe even embodied the difficulty of witness. And I'm interested in if you can say more about what you talk about as the loss of history, as the history of race, and your role, which is also sometimes our role, participating in intellectual history, as an echo of the role of the person making a sketch, implicated in also the violence of the unaffordable book, and the traumatic impact of the newsmen with cameras jumping over each other, right? So that the complicated act of witnessing. I want to thank you for the way that you took it on, and I also just wanted to ask you about how you reflect on that role.
Oh, thank you.
Do you want to go first?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. So I've thought a lot about your question, and I read a lot about that in my book. I believe that prisons damage people in the wider society. So in that sense, I'm very much aligned with an abolitionist perspective. But I also take very seriously Angela Davis's counsel that we should perform a balancing act as prison activists of working hard to abolish the central role that prisons play in our culture and our communities, but at the same time attending passionately to the needs of incarcerated people. My fear with some of the critical resistance scholarship or some of the anti-penal activism is that there's a kind of emphasis on flinging open the prison doors that forgets about the ways in which structural harms play themselves out at the level of individual bodies and experiences. And so I'm very interested in trying to theorize and draw attention to the political dimensions of people trying to come to terms with their individual experiences, and that what I try to do in my own work is to link that important individual work to the larger project of rethinking this crazy system that we're a part of. So I'm very much interested in not suggesting that we can just have better prisons or that it's okay because people somehow find a way to transform themselves in the system. But I do think that it's important in the meantime to draw attention to the incredibly important work that people are doing to survive and to make a life and to have community, because some of them will spend the rest of their lives there, so that feels very important to me.
Thank you for your questions. Your presentation was super meaningful for me, as I told you yesterday.
A little closer to the mic.
When we listened to Elizabeth Alexander last night, and she had this phrase, I don't know if it's exactly her words, but it was something like thinking about sort of how and at our disarticulated black body, what it would mean to put back together in methodology. And I started reflecting on this project and sort of the challenges for me, which were really ethical questions about as I said earlier, what it means to encounter the images in an exhibition in a library. And so that was sort of where I started. And I don't know, I've tried to bring in other forms to sort of figure out the way that we might encounter them again. And for me, I woke up at like 5 this morning thinking, I had a dream, and I was thinking about this project. And I thought of Inez's poem, really, when at the end she says, "Oh my God," and ends there. And I felt like I understood it again. And so after looking at these images for a couple years now, they came to me in a different way. So, I feel like I've tried to sort of think about the role of poetics, which I was so grateful for your talk yesterday.
to allow for the kind of movement and sort of, I mean, I try to, in my writing, I'm sort of trying to invoke anti-captivity, really, and sort of what it means to, you know, thinking about abolition and writing as sort of not producing knowledge that fixes or captures the subject, again. So, and that's the challenge, right? That's the process. So that's where I'm at with it. Thanks.
Thank you. Other questions? Right. Yeah, no, he's just getting on the mic. Thank you.
Thank you for the panel. It was brilliant. It's a question directed to Professor Sweeney, sort of related to the previous question. I was wondering first if, you know, if your books are going to be allowed in the prison, both the academic book and the more testimonial one. And also, what restrictions are there for the sort of research and activism that you do as an academic and researcher? And because if you say that there are these kind of restrictions for books, I imagine that there are very strong restrictions for advocacy and just research.
So thank you for that question. I did work in 3 states, and only one of them has let me come back to the prison with the book, and that's the state of Ohio. So I did go back, and there were only 3 women left who had participated in the research. But so we did a book discussion of the book, which was a really wonderful experience. And it was so interesting to see how the women were reading themselves and responding to their representations. There was one woman who talked a lot, well, Sissy actually, talked a lot about how she had to keep reassuring her daughter that she was proud to be in the book because she'd had so many negative representations of her. So it was really important for her to be able to give the book to her daughter down the line as something to be proud of and to hold on to. Just another quick story in terms of the aesthetics of books. There's a woman who was very interested in books as something that could be beautiful and soft to touch. She wouldn't read hardback books because the softback books were so much more comforting. She was very interested in the smell of books. And she said, she told a story about when she got the book, she couldn't stop smelling it. And a friend of hers saw her and was making fun of her about being a book sniffer because this fresh new book that was hers was so important to her. Anyway, the irony is that this book that's about the restrictions of books is not allowed in some of the places where the women are featured. To your other question, I applied to 10 states to do the research and only 3 let me in, and my own state, Michigan, wouldn't allow me in because there have been so many class action suits about sexual abuse against prisoners, so there was a real shutting out of researchers. So when I started this work, didn't have the publication record that I have now, so my fear is that it will be harder and harder for me to actually get in the doors again.
Marisa,
thank you all for this really wonderful papers. My question is for Stephanie, who again, I really appreciate your work. And it's a 3-part question, so one question, but these points are related. And I'm wondering, in your reading of these narratives about how enslaved women sort of empowered themselves through understanding the economic dimensions of their commodification and purchasing themselves, if there was a kind of gendered female dimension to this understanding in that, I was thinking about stealing away, right, as a form of resistance and a form of resisting their commodification, and how maybe perhaps enslaved women didn't have as many opportunities to run away and steal themselves in the way that men did.
based on their kind of being tethered through childcare and all of that. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you think about stealing away as resistance parallel to this kind of acquisition of financial understanding. And then my other part of this question is, how do you balance the sort of trauma and terror of the marketplace with this narrative of resistance and knowledge acquisition? So, thanks.
Thank you so much for your questions. Well, as you mentioned, with enslaved women in particular, there were far fewer opportunities to acquire freedom. And so in that respect, it is certainly something that enslaved women, this was a problem that was peculiar, or concern that was peculiar to enslaved women, and it was far more important, I think, for many of these enslaved women who purchased themselves to purchase themselves and to try to secure the freedom of their children as well. Particularly, you see concerns about female children because of, you know, the sexual abuse that could be part of the experience of slavery. So you do see that women in particular seem to embrace this mode of liberty, this mode of freedom, self-purchase. You also see a lot of enslaved men concerned about their either enslaved mothers, aunts, you know, daughters, because they're also trying to remove them from a system that will not only keep them in bondage, but also exploit them sexually. How do I think about stealing away? To me, this is in many respects, and I'm going out on a limb here, this is in many respects, I guess, an alternative mode of running away. It's a far more expensive mode of running away, but nonetheless, I think in the case of many enslaved women, this is their chance. It takes far longer than running away, but it's a far more secure mode of stealing away than running away and you know, marriage and, you know, setting up maroon societies and so forth. So for me, this is the counterpart for enslaved women to stealing away. The terror and the horror. I'm personally struck by the terror and the horror that many enslaved women express in their stories, and as I mentioned, you see on the one hand this, you know, this recognizing that I have to acknowledge that this is part and parcel of the system, and I have to acknowledge that, you know, I am valued, I am property, in order to move away from the terror and horror of the system. So in order to escape the terror and the horror, you have to at the same time recognize and acknowledge your own commodification. So for me, they balance it by you know, considering it a necessary evil. For what I think was most striking to me is that it doesn't stop. So you would think once they purchase themselves or once they purchase their children, the terror and the horror stops. But in many cases, the terror and the horror doesn't stop. For example, Charity Bowery, she was able to secure her own freedom, which was rightfully hers by will, but was stolen from her by her mistress, who kept her in slavery after her husband died. She attempted to buy every single one of her children, and she approached her mistress in order to do so, and her mistress turned her down every single time she attempted to negotiate terms to purchase her children's freedom. So each and every time that she accumulated the money, she confronted the terror and the horror of this knowledge, of this reality every single time. And her one son she was particularly concerned about because he was free-spirited and he resisted, you know, he was resisting his bondage, eventually was shot dead by an owner who her mistress sold him off to. So in many ways, the terror and the horror of the situation didn't stop, even with self-purchase, like Charity Bowery's experience. Hope that answers your question.